Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam Sujatra, peace be with you. Let me also begin by thanking the Islamic Renaissance Front for taking the initiative to organize this seminar, this discussion. Now, what I'll try to do today, because I have at the back of my mind the seminar we took part in on the 10th of September on Islam without sectarianism, and I don't want to repeat myself. So this time, since the topic is responding to extremism and sectarianism in the Muslim world, what I would like to do is to first look at extremism and then look at sectarianism. We have to be very clear in our minds that extremism and sectarianism are not one and the same thing. They're not. We have to make a distinction between these two concepts, extremism and sectarianism. The way they manifest themselves, extremism and sectarianism, there are some similarities in the manifestations of extremism and sectarianism. But these are two different concepts. And that's something which I'll try to elaborate upon in the course of this presentation. And I want to begin with extremism. Perhaps want to try to define extremism, because part of the problem in discussing extremism is the confusion over the term itself. I would like to see extremism as an attitude or an action which violates an existing equilibrium. That's extremism. Extremism is something which challenges a middle-of-the-road attitude or approach. That's extremism. Extremism is something which transgresses norms which most people in a society accept as moderate. That would be extremism. As you can see from this attempt at understanding extremism, it's something that's very subjective. All that I've said can be easily challenged by a person who has a different way of looking at this phenomenon, which is why extremism is so difficult to try to fathom in reality. Let me give you an example of how extremism can become extremely problematic. There was a country in West Asia where people who prayed regularly, Muslims, this country is 98% Muslim, who prayed 5 times a day, who fasted during Ramadan, who went for the Hajj, and who were Muslim in other aspects of behavior, perhaps in their attire, in the way in which they interacted with people and so on. But people who were generally very courteous, civilized, but had all these traits associated with Islam. A lot of these people were seen as extremists for quite a long while. They were seen as extremists. In fact, newspapers in this particular country described the president of that country at that time, who went on a pilgrimage, for the Hajj. They said, well, this just confirms that he's an extremist for going for the Hajj, mind you, in a Muslim majority country, 98% Muslim. And because he was also observant of the Salat, they said, yes, he must be an extremist, this guy. Would you believe me if I told you that country was Turkey? Turkey. Turkey, during that long period of Kemalism, if you like, Kemalism at its peak, where when they recruited soldiers in Turkey at that time to the armed forces, and if the new recruit did not consume alcohol, did not socialize in a certain way, did not dance, he was seen as a fanatic, as an extremist. Today, you'll find that in Turkey, things have changed. The vast majority of Muslims are Muslims who observe their faith. They don't see each other as fanatics or extremists in this new environment, which goes to show that a term like extremism, it is something that is very fluid. It changes depending upon situation and circumstance, which is also the reason why we should be very careful about the use of this term. Though it is something very, very important when we say, he's an extremist. What do we really mean? This is why I began by providing a general notion of extremism, and then I tried to locate it in a concrete situation to show that it is very, very difficult to try to explain what extremism really is. Now, the other thing that we have to realize about extremism, anywhere in the world, but especially in a country like Malaysia, is this, that it is an attitude, extremism, which is not confined to any particular religion. And there is the tendency for people to say extremists, therefore must be Muslims. Especially when you have in this country people who give the impression that all the extremists are from one particular community. If you read some newspapers in this country, and I don't want to mention the newspapers and the writers who write this way, the extremists must all be Muslims. To be very frank with you, this is totally false. You have extremists in all religions. Extremists based upon the concrete situations that we should deal with, these are extremists. Let me give you 3 examples of extremism from 3 faiths other than Islam, before I talk about Islam, since our discussion today is about Islam. This is something that we must understand. First, let me give you an example of extremism in contemporary Christianity, which is not even highlighted, mind you, in the mainstream media or in public discourse. And what is this extremism that I'm talking about? There are millions of Christians today, all over the world, mainly in the United States of America, but also in East Asia, in our part of the world, who would be described as the Christian right, more specifically evangelists, more specifically evangelists of a certain type, because they're also evangelists of different types, but evangelists of a certain type subscribing to Christianity who believe that the salvation that is about to come is linked to the return of the Messiah, the return of the Christ, of the Messiah, to that part of the world where he was, and that return of the Messiah will lead to the strengthening of Israel. And in fact, a strong Israel is a prerequisite for that return in their thinking. The Messiah returns, powerful Israel, which would be in total control of its environment, that is a prerequisite. And when that moment comes, everyone would of course convert to Christianity, including of course the Jews. But this they don't tell the Jews, that they will all convert to Christianity, and Christianity would triumph. Now, because they believe in this, and this is the part that is very dangerous, because they believe in this, these right-wing evangelist types, they supported the US, British-led war against the people of Iraq. in 2003. You have a lot of literature that will show you this, how they supported this war. They felt that this was something very, very important, because you have to change the face of West Asia and North Africa. You have to change the face of the entire region for the Messiah to return. So this was very important for the war against the people of Iraq. And a lot of the chaplains who went there as part of the armed forces, they were actually evangelists. And this has been very well established in a couple of books, including the book called Armies of God by Ian Buchanan. Ian Buchanan, who is someone who is linked to Malaysia, a British Muslim. And even his later book, Sang Nila Utama and the Line of Judah, which just published, in that book also he shows that link with the evangelist movement and the Christian right and the war in Iraq and, of course, other things that have happened. They supported the bombardment of Libya because, again, it was part of the larger design. They're completely behind the war against the people of Syria. These groups, they support all this because this is part of a much larger design and they see it as a divine plan. And most of all, they want the Palestinian liberation movement to be crushed completely because they feel that is a big hindrance to Israel and to the return of the Messiah. So you have people who believe in this, who support wars which have led to the death of millions of human beings, millions, mind you, if you look at all these wars together. And yet, does the mainstream media describe them as extremists? Does it even talk about this link and how it works? They don't, because they control the mainstream media. It is something which is in their hands. This is something that one has to realize. How complex this game is, what is happening before our eyes. Because all the time, you know, we say, the extremists, the Muslims, and you know, so on. But look at the bigger picture. This is something which I see as a great danger to humankind. Let me give you a second example, where again, another religion has been manipulated for vile purposes, and again, it has led to deaths of people, not in the millions, but at least perhaps a few hundreds, perhaps even a couple of thousands by now. I'm referring to Buddhist Myanmar. Extremist, violent, fanatical interpretation, misinterpretation, distortion of Buddhism by some monks in Myanmar. Viratu, a famous name now, infamous name if you like, who is very much part of this. And people have been killed. Just yesterday, 20 Rohingyans were killed, and there have been other instances because at the moment things are on the boil in the Rakhine province. Here again, distortion of Buddhism. As in the earlier case, distortion of Christianity for extremist purposes. If you look at the interpretations of the religion and of the situation of the Buddhists in Myanmar by Viratu and other like-minded Buddhists, it's just amazing how extremist they are in their thinking. But they've been able to do this. Of course, some people criticize them, including Buddhists and others who are of Buddhist background, but they may not be practicing Buddhist, but they are very critical of what is happening. Nonetheless, it is a trend that you cannot ignore, what's been happening in Myanmar. And not just in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, we also had that sort of trend. Again, Buddhists, earlier period. Now, of course, it has become a little different because of the change in the politics in Sri Lanka. But it was happening in Sri Lanka too. So even other religion associated with peace for millennia, but distorted by certain individuals to serve a certain purpose, extremism at work leading to violence. A third example, India and Hinduism. Especially if you look at what's been happening in the last few months. Again, not highlighted in the media. Because, you know, the mainstream Western media ever since the days of the colonial empire, the British colonial empire, have assiduously cultivated a certain image of Hinduism, which had served their interests. And therefore, they will not allow that image of Hinduism to be tarnished by the realities on the ground. Hinduism distorted in very vile terms today by a group that is associated with some of the Hindus in power, whose interpretations are so extreme, and it has led to deaths. For instance, a Muslim who, in the privacy of his home, consumes beef is killed. I mean, to me, this is just amazing. A person who, in the privacy of his home, consumes beef is killed because the cow is a sacred animal, as far as mainstream Hinduism is concerned. And a number of other instances which are very similar. There were at least 2 other instances of beef consuming Muslims being killed. And again, people being isolated and marginalized and discriminated and so on because of things of the sort. That's extremism too. But do you see this extremism being highlighted in the media? It is reported here and there, but never highlighted. Because those who run the media and control the media they have a certain view of the world. This is what we must always understand. And they will go all out to perpetuate and propagate that view of the world. And targeting Islam is part of their mission, without any doubt at all. Islamophobia is not an accident. If you look at the distortions of Islam in the mainstream media and the way in which it is done, sometimes with tremendous subtlety and sophistication, this is not an accident. Even Kofi Annan, not the most enlightened of human beings, even Kofi Annan once said that when you talk of Islamophobia, he said, you're just talking of a new name for ancient phenomenon. And he's right. It has been there for a long, long while. It goes back to the Crusades. It goes back to the 1st century after the Prophet. There's attempts to distort Islam consciously, including a distorted version of the Quran, propagating this distorted version, and it has gone on. One is not trying to exonerate Muslims for 1 minute from their own shortcomings and their own wrongdoings. These things do happen, and we must condemn them, as we have done, as I have done all my life in addressing this challenge. But nonetheless, one cannot run away from this larger picture. If we do, we are deceiving ourselves. There is undoubtedly Islamophobia. There is undoubtedly this larger attempt to target Islam and to single out Islam for a certain purpose, because it is linked to power, dominance, hegemony. This is what it is. It is linked to a certain perception of Islam, which the Western world, when it was religious, now when it is less religious, more secular, it still carries that same perception. It is like the attitude of the mainstream media to China, and I used to make this comparison. When it was communist, China was presented in a very negative light. Now that it is capitalist, it is still presented in a negative light. It doesn't matter whether you're communist or capitalist, it's still presented in a negative light. Why? Because it involves power. That is the root problem. It involves power. Capitalist China today is a challenge to Western dominance. They saw communist China at that time as a challenge. Likewise, Islam. Whether it is the Islam of the mullahs, the Islam of some of the very fanatical groups, or the Islam of someone who is an observant Muslim but a very moderate person, it is still seen as a threat because it's Islam. What's the example, the concrete example? The West did not tolerate Muhammad Mossadegh. He was a Muslim, a practicing Muslim, but he was certainly not a mullah. He was not a mullah. In fact, he kept some distance away from the mullah and so on. But he was seen as a threat because he wanted to nationalize oil, which he did. The oil that was his people's oil. They got rid of him. And they strengthened the position of the Shah. I think you know this is part of history. Then Iran comes under Khomeini, very different from Mohammad Mossadegh. Revolution, Khomeini comes to power, beard. Mossadegh had no beard, clean shaven like, me and Farouk and so on. But he was seen as a threat. Now you have the bearded Khomeini, mullah, also a threat because the underlying factor is power. Khomeini also wanted an independent, self-reliant Iran that had dignity, that would not bow to Western power. So they had to crush him. So this is the reality when it comes to one particular religion and the way they deal with it. So I think we have to understand these things when we start talking about extremism and sectarianism. This is the larger picture. Let me also add very quickly here, friends, because you're waiting to hear Dato Redzuan, that as far as the Muslim world is concerned, I would regard the vilest manifestation of extremism in the Muslim world. We're talking of the Muslim world's own extremism now. It is the way in which quite a lot of Muslims have become adherents to a takfiri mentality. That is extremism, a takfiri mentality. Basically, a takfiri mentality, as I'm sure all of you here know, is this mentality that denies the Islamic identity, the Islamic persona of other Muslims who don't subscribe to your view of Islam. Your own, often narrow, bigoted view of Islam. If you don't subscribe to it, you are seen as non-Muslim, apostate, and you can be isolated, you can be marginalized, you can be tortured, you can even be killed in extreme cases. And this is happening. It is something which has grown in the last few decades, without any doubt at all, partly because of power, partly because of the situation that some Muslims are in. There are various reasons why this is happening, but the takfiri mentality is a clear example of extremism within the Muslim world. It need not lead to denying that a person is a Muslim. Even if you project this idea that this is the only way in which you can be a good Muslim, meaning by which all other approaches to Islam are somehow not legitimate, that can be a problem. It's also an extremist way of looking at the world. For instance, if you have someone saying that a virtuous Muslim woman is one who uses the hijab. If she doesn't use the hijab, she's not a good Muslim. I mean, that is an example of an extremist judgment on a human being. There are many, many Muslim women who use the hijab. There are also Muslim women who don't use the hijab, who may be good people. But this sort of judgment is an example of extremist behavior. That happens. And there are other examples in the Muslim world. My friend, Prof. Hashim Kamali, who was invited to help formulate the Afghan constitution after the events of 2001, 2002. He was one of those who was part of the team. You know, the mullahs who were there, the religious scholars, many of them in Afghanistan, they objected to him being in that committee. Not because of his lack of knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence, because he is one of the 5 top Islamic jurists in the world, recognized, acknowledged. That was not the issue. You know what they said? How can you take part in the formulation of a constitution for Afghanistan, which is a religious society, when you don't have a beard? That was the objection, when you don't have a beard. Yeah? So they had a long debate on whether this person who didn't have a beard could take part in the formulation of a constitution for Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, as I'm sure Junaid will tell you, even in Pakistan, sometimes there are debates about this, about the length of the beard. And how do you measure the length of the beard, whether it is from below the lip or from below the chin? It sounds ridiculous, right? But these are, manifestations, examples of the sort of thinking which is quite, dangerous. Let me very quickly try to address this issue, since we're talking about the Muslim world. What explains this? Why is this become stronger and stronger? There are a number of reasons, some of which I've alluded to, but very quickly, interpretation is one of them. The way in which religious text is interpreted. It is also related to power. Why these interpretations take place. When you find that you have, say, this unholy marriage between people with a very narrow view of the religion and power, as it had happened in the case of Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud, its relationship with the Wahhabi movement, that marriage that took place from the 19th century perhaps, some would say, it began towards the end of the 18th century. But whatever it is the sort of thinking which is very, very dangerous. It has become stronger and stronger. So power is a factor. It's also related to suppression. When religious groups are suppressed, you'll find that even those who may not hold a narrow view, they become more and more dogmatic in their position because of suppression, because you don't give them any space. In other words, those who are against them contribute to the situation. Don't give them any space, suppress them, oppress them, marginalize them. This leads to this sort of situation, narrow interpretations. It is also something that happens as a result of active, conscious manipulation by various people. And I think Junaid had referred to Afghanistan. The people who are behind the Mujahideens, that whole movement to fight against the Soviet Union, and it was a legitimate movement against Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But if you look at the way they were manipulated and the way religion was used, it was conscious. Brzezinski, the man who wrote the book called The Grand Chessboard. In The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski, who is still around, and apparently he still advises President Obama. Now, Brzezinski, in that book, says that we had our Vietnam, let this be your Vietnam, Afghanistan. And this is what it became in the end. And as a result of what had happened in Afghanistan, you have Al-Qaeda, and you have all the offshoots of Al-Qaeda, and it is something which continues to express itself in what is happening in West Asia today, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, everywhere. It is this new phenomenon. So the active manipulation of groups of this sort, that also contributes to this. And sometimes friends. And this is in relation to what has just happened. You find that underlying expressions of extremism. You take the language, the pronouncements of someone like Donald Trump. 6 electoral votes, Brother Redzuan, from the presidency. He may have already reached it by now. President, right? Yeah. So the new president of the United States of America. If you look at some of his pronouncements, clearly extremist. Clearly extremist, yeah? Against the Hispanics, the Mexicans, extremist, his expressions. Against Muslims, extremist. But if we are just trapped in his expressions, in his pronouncements, and fail to understand what is behind it, what has led to this sort of expressions and why, a lot of people support an individual who, for many of us, and I'm sure for a lot of Americans, this guy is a little bizarre, saying all these things, but nonetheless they support him. Why? This is why I think it's so important to look at the underlying causes. A detailed analysis will have to be done later, and I seek your forgiveness if I say things which I may have to correct later. but from what one knows of the socio-economic, socio-cultural, socio-political situation in the United States of America and how things have been developing, if I look at this in relation to Brexit, what had happened in Britain, there are similarities, believe me. It is related to this tragic situation in the United States of America. This is a nation of the middle class, the United States of America. It is the biggest and most important component in the demographic and socioeconomic structure of the United States of America. A big segment of this middle class has been stagnating in the last 10 to 15 years. Lack of social mobility, lack of jobs. There are people who have dropped from the middle class to the lower income groups in the United States of America. These things have been well documented. Now, one of the reasons why Trump won is because of this. If you analyze the areas where he did well, and I was doing this a couple of hours ago with a couple of friends, a lot of the areas are related to poor, depressed areas where the majority of people are American whites who had seen progress in an earlier period, but things are different now. They are angry, they are unhappy, they channel that to this guy who is the last person who would be championing their interests. Because if you look at this man and his record, his background, everything, but they just need a channel. They need a voice. I mean, just like in the case of Britain, the solution is not in getting out of the European Union, but this is what happened. Again, a lot of Brits feeling marginalized, left out, some impoverished. This is the situation. And this is partly because of this sort of economic system that has evolved over time, which has become global. And these two countries, Britain and the United States, are at the very apex of that sort of economic system. It is what we call neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism, which unlike earlier phases of capitalism, which generated growth and productivity and so on, neoliberal capitalism has resulted in the concentration of wealth, in the widening gap between rich and poor. It is said of the United States, and this is true, that 1% of the population, their wealth is more than that of 50% of the American population. Greater and greater concentration of wealth. And globally, this is what's happening. I'm sure you know, and this is from Credit Suisse, mind you, of all bodies. They've said this, that at the beginning of 2016, 1% of the world's population owns and controls more wealth than the rest of the human family put together. Isn't this amazing? The disparities, the concentration of wealth. And as a result of that, you have things like Trump and the expressions of extremism, actually. In other words, we are going to see more and more extremism unless we deal with the root causes. And the root causes are related to this, to wealth, the distribution of wealth, power, the economy, politics, and so on and so forth. So I think it is so important for us to try to understand this when we are confronted with this sort of situation. Instead of just reacting to extremism like what the mainstream media does all the while. They'll all react to things that Trump says and some of the other things associated with the man, his groping and all the rest of it, which are all sideshows. Of course, the public is more interested in these things, but you know, what is really happening is something else, which is far more serious. And this is what we have to address. And those of us, activists, scholars, and others, I think we also have to learn to address the underlying issues and how to overcome this. Because if we don't, then I think the human family as a whole is actually courting disaster. We are at the edge of the precipice. We don't have much time. Thank you very much.